Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to Building the Black Educator Pipeline podcast. I am your host, Shayna Terrell. I am Director of Pipeline Programming at the Center for Black Educator Development. Of course, I'm an educative activist out here dedicated to the freedom and liberation of her people. So I just want to always shout out the South Bronx, who raised me, and of course, these Philly streets, who made me. Thank you to everyone who came last week to celebrate our 10th show. So appreciate you guys. We are truly humbled by the love and the support that we are receiving on this platform. And as always, major shout out to Citizens Ed for giving us the opportunity to talk to real people in a real struggle, telling their real truths. Before we hop into today's topic, we have to celebrate that it is Teacher Appreciation Week. Shout out to all my teachers out there. I mean, the way this year went with the pandemic, it should have been Teacher Appreciation Year, okay? With all the nonsense teachers had to go through. But from us at the center, we want to say, dear Black teachers, we see you and we thank you and we love you. So shout out to Black Teachers Matters co-founders Danielle Moneyham and Brooke B for introducing the hashtag Think a Black Teacher on our third episode. So we really want to elevate and lift up that hashtag this week. So hashtag Think a Black Teacher for Teacher Appreciation Week. So please use that hashtag to thank a Black teacher, tag a Black teacher, and tell them why you thank them. Feel free to go ahead and use that during this show. Again, hashtag Think a Black Teacher. I would like to thank and shout out Joe Shepard, Sharon Batts, Sylvia Lugo, Miss Ventura, Lourdes Fahar, and Miss Ortiz. Those were all my elementary school teachers, Black and Latinx women, who helped me be who I am today. So I want to say thank you. Because of you, I am, and because of you, I will be. So thank you to those women. So shout out and hashtag Think a Black Teacher. So I want to get into today's show's theme. We'll still be talking about the benefits of Black educators and their impact on culture in the classroom. Today's topic will center around liberation and social justice. We'll be focused on what we like to call educator activism. It's a term that I hear my CEO, Sharif El-Mekki, use a lot. And it really describes education and activism in one sense, working together, because great teaching is service and activism all wrapped up in one. So I want to shout out to my co-conspirators and everybody who always watches us and supports us every week. So in the comments, please tell us, what does social justice in the classroom look like to you? So if you've seen it effectively, if you've done it effectively, or you have an aspiration of what it would look like, please answer that question in the chat. What does social justice in the classroom look like to you? I'm excited for today's guest. Ismael Jimenez will be joining us today. Ismael Jimenez is a dedicated educator who for the last 15 years has worked with students in Philadelphia from preschool age to high school. During the past several years, Ishmael has assisted in the development of the updated social studies curriculum for the School District of Philadelphia and led several sessions around social studies content for social studies instructors teaching middle school to high school level. Along with being a teacher leader in the School District of Philadelphia, Ishmael has facilitated several professional developments with colleagues in the school district and at post-secondary institutions like University of Penn, Penn State, Princeton University on issues ranging from structural racism to bridging the knowledge gap of students between high school and post-secondary institutions. Currently, Ishmael is a core member of the Racial Justice Organizing Committee, Black Lives Matter Philadelphia, founding member of the Melanated Educators Collective, and co-founder of the Philadelphia Black History Collaborative. In addition, Ishmael is an active participant in several other organizations that seek racial justice in education through curriculum development and grassroots political education. The philosophy orientation that guides Ishmael's teaching and activism is rooted in the theoretical educational framework developed by Paolo Freire, which emphasizes the interconnected nature of education with participating in the transformation of the world. So shout out to Ishmael for being on the show. I would love to welcome him. Ishmael, hey! Welcome. Oh, there you go. Welcome.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
We're excited to have you. Dope. So what I always do is I think that it's always beneficial for folks to hear about your journey to education. Like, why did you decide to become an educator?
Oh, well, this is usually a story that I always refer back to, and it's not just as an educator, because education happens in the building and outside the building as well, more outside the building, arguably. But in fourth grade, I was going to a majority white school in the surrounding suburbs of Philadelphia, and I used to have a stuttering problem when I was younger, so I used to mess up my words and everything. So in fourth grade, the teacher asked the class a question. I rose my hand and I started stuttering when I began to answer, and the class laughed at me. Well, then my fourth grade teacher said, "Oh, don't mind him. His people talk that way." And mind you, fourth grade, you don't wrap your mind around his people, their people, all that, not in the full gravity of things.
Mm-hmm.
So the librarian at the school heard about that. And the teacher apologized. My parents, I got to give it to them, definitely brought it to the attention of the principal and really advocated on my behalf. But the librarian gave me her original copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X in fourth grade. So I read that in fourth grade, like fifth grade, sixth grade. By the time I was in fifth grade, kids were calling me Ishmael X at school.
That's dope.
Yeah, I was always about it. So I didn't do well in school, though. I ended up getting sent to behavioral school, kicked out in middle school. I ended up graduating high school with a 1.6 GPA, taking 8 classes in 8 periods. So I had to forego my lunch the last 2 marking periods in order to graduate on time. But already at that point, I knew that I wanted to pursue education, because although I didn't do good in school, I loved education. I loved reading. I loved debating. I loved all that stuff. And I wanted to reach children like me, who I could have easily just fell through the cracks and ended somewhere else. I even point to that reading the autobiography of Malcolm X in fourth grade as the point where that saved my life. If I didn't get introduced to that at that point in my life, I could have easily went, all the way left field and not be here talking to you right now.
And I appreciate stories like yours, because I think that people sometimes have in their heads this idea of what an educator is in a specific path that you're supposed to take. But I also think that your story connects to a lot of our student stories, who weren't, or who we would consider not such great students, maybe not so engaged in school, or not intrinsically motivated, or just not connected to what's happening, right? That doesn't mean that they don't want to be educated, because your story speaks to that. You are here in fourth grade, child, reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. So to say that you weren't intelligent or didn't want to be educated or learn, right? But your grades and how people dictate, or how we kind of describe students or project this idea of what a student is based on grading, right? Or based on class participation. So your story is one that I think a lot of young people can identify with, which I think is dope. Because you've been a teacher for how long now?
12 years. Actually, I literally recently just left the classroom in February to take the social studies curriculum specialist position for the school district.
Yes, and that we're definitely going to get into. But for 12 years, you entered education to specifically teach African American history. Is that true?
Yes. When I was, of course, I had to go to community college first. No 4-year institution was going to accept my 1.6 GPA.
That's right. Tell your story of perseverance, okay?
But like I said right off the bat, I think around 15, 16, I decided I wanted to teach. And it's specifically in Philadelphia, because I even had an experience going to schools in Philadelphia along with the suburbs. And I even saw the gaps in between there, and how students in certain places are dehumanized while other students are given the benefit of the doubt. And even within those institutions, how that's differentiated based on race, which is a larger story. But for myself, it was kind of struggling through the community college aspect, learning how to write better, being able to transfer to Temple. And it's real interesting. I always reference back when you have an exit interview with your counselor. My counselor at the time in high school was like, "Oh, are you sure college is right for you?" and all this. And I was like, yeah. I was like, I'm going to community college. I'm going to get an associate's, and then I plan to go to Temple University and get my bachelor's and certified in teaching. And I plan to teach in Philadelphia. While I was at Temple University, and I was blessed enough to take some classes in the African American Studies department, which every elective I took. So Black political social thought.
But me too. I'm a Temple grad, and me too. Every chance I got to take an elective, it was in that fam. So yes. Shout out. Yes.
Yeah. So like I was just like, I love this. I mean, like I loved it before. Like that was my jam. But I wish I would have even got my degree in African American Studies at the time. Hopefully a doctorate one day. And
yes. Okay. We won't speak that into existence. It will be a doctorate.
Exactly. Speak that into existence. But then in 2005, it was like a year before I graduated with my undergrad from Temple, I heard that the School District of Philadelphia is made African American history a graduation requirement. Mm-hmm. And that just cemented to me. I was like, I'm going to teach in Philadelphia. I'm going to go to the place where nobody really wants to go because, you know, racist, anti-Black perceptions of this society. And I'm going to go there and teach the truth. I even came to the field. I was like, yo, if I can just reach one child in 10 years, man, like that's more than most people can claim. So I came to the situation like, you know, very clear-eyed. And it's real interesting because even though I graduated with my bachelor's in 2006, I literally just got married, just about to have a child. So I couldn't student teach and pay the bills. Yep. So I actually ended up working at a transitional housing childcare, first as an after-school teacher, eventually as an administrative assistant. And I used to walk to work like that. We were poor, man. We lived above a store at 5th and Lehigh, if you're familiar with the city. And I used to walk from there to 4th and Master every day to go to work. Wow. And luckily at the job, they recognized that I was capable and, you know, willing to do above and beyond. And they helped me student teach. So they allowed me to flex my hours and student teach, even threw some money towards me getting my graduate degree. And then I was able to get certified by 2009. And then I jumped right in, was able to pick from a list of schools. I saw Germantown High School, and that would have been the high school that I was supposed to go to if I remained in Philadelphia after middle school, because I went to Roosevelt. So I'm like, I'm teaching there. I'm going to go heavy in there. And as soon as I got there, they're like, oh, you want to teach African-American history? Here you go. And I was like, I love this place.
And there's so much in your story that I want people to hear right now. One is the story just of you of perseverance. And as a young Black man, having that in you to say like, okay, I didn't meet the standard, but I have a plan for myself and I have a plan for them how to get there. And I think that's important to help our children see. They don't have to meet this imaginary standard of excellence, but helping people develop a plan on how to get where they want to go is important. In the village, right? You had so many people that were able to like support you and that were rooting for you, and how important that is as Black educators for us to build those villages for students, right? Like it has to happen outside the home. They need other people. You have folks that's like, all right, you want a student teach here? Let's flex them hours. So I think that that's dope. That story of perseverance and the fact that you had a village. And shout out to your wife, okay, for the struggle. I just want to shout that sister out for believing and trusting is important in your situation. Now, before we get into like social justice in the classroom, I want to wrap this around, but what I want to talk about is from hearing your name, right? Ishmael Jimenez. People would assume that you are Latinx. It would be correct to assume that, but I would love for you to talk about how you classify and like how you identify.
Yes. And thank you for bringing it up. Actually, I didn't even know my last name was pronounced Jimenez until I was 17 years old. So like even today, I don't use Jimenez when I introduce myself because I feel like I would be faking the funk, like claiming a culture that I really have no idea about. So my father is a first generation Latino man. His father was from the Dominican Republic and his mother is from Puerto Rico. It's real ironic that my dad's father actually got to America in the 1920s on a boat from the Dominican Republic. I don't know those stories, right? I just generally, but my mother was Black and from Liverpool, England, of all places. So from a young age, my mother always shared her experiences growing up in Liverpool as the only Black girl on her block, and kind of the racist experiences that she had from a young age, and especially what happened to me after fourth grade. Like, without my mother like sitting and breaking down some of the complex concepts in the autobiography of Malcolm X, I might not have made it or understood or comprehended on the level that I needed to in order to really internalize it. So from that jump, I'm like when people ask like Latino or Black, like I didn't know. There were no Latinos growing up around me. The only Latinos I really knew was my dad's side of the family, and they kind of rejected me. When my father married my mother, his parents did not talk to him for 5 years because he married a Black woman. When my grandmother passed away several years ago, she left money to all the great grandkids except my children because I married a Black woman. Even when I brought my wife over there for the first time to meet them, only brought her over there once because it's a traumatic place to be. My grandmother even refused to look at her. And I can't recall any conversations that I even had with them growing up because I was always kind of like looked at as like not the desirable grandson. So from a young age, like I refused to eat beans and rice. That's how much I rejected Latinx culture, because unfortunately, embedded within that culture is a history of anti-Blackness. Not only a history of anti-Blackness, but a culture that embraces anti-Blackness. It's positive if you light up the race, because Latinos span the gambit, right? It's not just one monolith. It goes from like Argentina to Costa Rica to Puerto Rico, Dominican, and it manifests itself differently. But anti-Blackness remains within all those places. And I always say, to my students when I'm teaching about this, when I'm talking about this, Spanish culture is rooted in Europe. It's rooted in anti-Blackness, and it's simply just another form of white supremacy in my mind. Especially if you don't acknowledge the African roots that are involved inherently in Latino identity, and if you don't reject the anti-Blackness, which is kind of indoctrinated just like within this society on everybody that grows up, in the language and even the images that are shown since a child.
Yes. So one of the things I talk about, especially when I talk to my Latinx brothers and sisters, but even my Black folks who are doing work with the Latinx population, especially kids, how important it is to educate yourself on other people and their cultures. So when we talk about culturally affirming environment, it doesn't only mean affirming Black folks. It literally means what it says, affirming people's culture. So one of the things that I talk about, especially when we're talking to Latinx folks, is one of the main things you hear is like Hispanic people or Latinx people need to understand that they're Black. So I always say, let's pause, right? Because we talk about Black, talk about race. So in essence, there are white Hispanics, there are white Latinx people. What we all are folks of African descent. What we all are folks from the African diaspora. And that is where the true history starts, in uniting our stories together with folks understanding their African history and their African lineage. But to force upon, you're Black. Some of them aren't Black, and some of them don't identify as Black, right? And that's okay. But what we all cannot deny and what we all need to be unified in is our African roots, for sure.
Yeah. And just to veggie back off of that real quick, like in American history, it's always been a racially dichotomous society, right? White and Black on, I won't even say the extremes, but one side and the other, right? And that's how the society, right? The one black blood drop rule, right? Fully affected America, not as clear in Spanish colonies or former colonies, right? So then you have a situation where you have groups of people moving here who have like a cultural identity that spans like, darker than 1,000 Midnights to lighter than the white. So like that reality, but when they come here, they're literally asked, okay, you're ethnically Hispanic. Okay, mark that down. What race are you? And so last census in 2010, I don't know what about 2020 yet. I need to look into this. But 2010, over the majority of people who self-identified as ethnically Hispanic mark themselves as racially white. And so for me, it's like, if you look at the history of this country, people who co-sign anti-Blackness, people who like can pass as white looking, can assimilate into the culture. But that is rooted with rejecting the Black aspect of really true American culture. So that is the most troubling thing for me, because people always say, oh, 2050, you know, whites will be a minority. Number one, that assumes that all quote unquote minorities all view each other the same, which we're already saying right here. It's not like that. And also ignores the fact that if these Latinos or self-identified Hispanics who are racially white assimilate to American society, white people will actually be in a larger majority in 2050 than they are now. So like when we're looking at this reality, and there's economic benefits that these people receive by identifying as such.
As white. Benefits, social privileges, all of that. But again, we live in America where white supremacy is the supreme, right? Not at all, but that is the notion that we are operating under. So if I'm identifying in terms of race, right, like, why not assimilate if I can't, right? But there's some people who want and will reject those views if they are educated properly, right? If social justice and liberation is implemented properly in the classroom. So with all that we said, the reason why I wanted to start with that and start with you and your identity and how this is effective, because the next level of that is, how did that impact your teaching? How did that impact you as a teacher?
Yeah, that's a heavy question, because like I told you, like I was not feeling, you know, even being a remotely identified as Latino at first, you know, because just off the strength that everything that existed in my past and the experiences I had growing up. So my first experience, my first 4 years teaching at Germantown High School, like that didn't really come up, because there were no Latino or Latinx students that went there, right? But in 2013, the school district closed 23 schools, and Germantown was one of them. I call it the Great Purge of 2013. So I was laid off. The school closed. I was laid off. I actually ended up working at Kepra for 6 weeks while I was laid off, ironically, right? But then the school district called me back, and I was selected to teach at Kensington Kappa. And it's really ironic. I was probably selected to teach there because the majority Latino, Latinx community due to my last name, because all they saw was my name and what school I was at before. So selected at this school, right from the bat, they're like, hey, Jimenez, da, da, da. I'm like, I go by Jimenez, da, da, da. So it was like a lot of, at first it was a huge culture shock for me. Like, how am I supposed to teach Black liberation to a culture, you know, which I oversimplified at the time, don't get it twisted, with a culture that was anti-Black, right? So for a couple years, like I wrestled with that, how to approach it, how to really like teach it, where you are centering, you know, Black voices and experiences within the course and how I taught it, but in a way where the students don't feel like, oh, that's the other, that's not me, I'm not a part of that, I'm not a part of that legacy, right? So over a while, I was able to kind of reconcile some of those contradictions in the way I teach. So like, you know, I knew I was starting to get good when, you know, my Dominican students would like, I think one specific example, this one Dominican girl started writing poetry about how she's a beautiful African queen.
Hey.
And at first she didn't consider herself Black. She considered herself Dominican or in Spanish. She called herself Spanish. I was like, oh, you're from Spain? Like, you know what I mean? Like, you don't even know people from Spain. You got no folk from Spain in your bloodline. Like, you know, she was an African sister. So like I started having that. And then I students started to articulate to me kind of like what that meant to them, that even their parents haven't wrestled with this kind of contradiction of being like their, you know, Latinx identity within the American like racialized context. Because when you're talking about like Dominicans and everything, like those are first generation folks. Like Puerto Ricans are much more like with it, probably because they're like, you know, colonial subjects of the American empire.
Right.
But like the, you know, the other students from like even Guatemala and Mexico, You
Haiti.
have to like start infusing like, yo, indigenous. There's a similarity between the African worldview and the indigenous worldview. Like, why is that division? Why does that happen? And so just like a Mexican person who you can straight up tell doesn't have no African blood, but straight up is indigenous. You're like, okay, so what indigenous tribe is your ancestors from? And I start having students be like, yeah, my parents are starting to look into that. This is the tribe that they're part of. I'm not sure, but like that opens up so much that even if you're not talking specifically like just about your, blackness within you, you're starting to explore like what I was taught. Is it really what I think I am? And I always hit the students over with a head with a Talib Kweli quote from a song. It's like, well, if you travel down the river of tears in the boat of broken promises with heavy fog, how can you be clear exactly what your knowledge is? Right? Yeah. So like I start the year off with that. Every time the student tries to give me an answer that they think that I want to hear, I would be like, well, how do you know that if you travel down the river of tears in the boat of broken promises, a heavy fall? You see their eyes roll, but they understand after a while. Be like, how do I even know? Like, I'm not Spanish. I'm not. So like that allowed me to even reconcile some of the issues that I even had for myself when it came to the Latinx culture, and gives me more hope even.
That's dope. And I think that's, again, something important for educators watching to hear, that you, who by nature, by DNA, were a person of Latinx descent, but still weren't reconciled with that in your soul, and then how that affected teaching, and then you had to do the work in order to be in front of a group of Latinx students, in order to teach them about themselves and their culture, to affirm who they are. Because I feel like, again, that gets glazed over when we talk about social justice and how to really involve students in social justice. It has to start with them understanding who they are and their being in the world before we can empower them and get them involved in anything active. Yeah. So for you, what does social justice in the classroom look like?
Well, number one is being honest. I think sometimes we're not honest to our children about like the true nature of what they're dealing with. Back in the day, folks used to be told in this society, you got to work twice as hard just to get half as much, right? Unfortunately, now it's like all you got to do is follow the rules, do this, do that. And if you don't make it, you're the failure. You failed. It's your fault. And you best believe the students internalize those realities. Well, if you internalize that from a young age, like being like told, like, unfortunately, like, the type of trauma our students experience from a young age in schools, like even my oldest son, we sent him to our local neighborhood school in Philly. I'm not going to say the school name because I ain't trying to throw too much shade. But the kids, they were yelling at the kids, telling my son while he was in first grade, like, if you keep on acting like this, you're going to end up in jail. And unfortunately, you know what it is. Like this happens too often to kids, especially Black and brown children who go to neighborhood schools. It's like they're already like it's like the bottom line. What did Chris Rock say in that comedy special? You're not supposed to be locked up. That's not something to be proud of.
Yes, but that's not something we should be lifting up, or a goal that we should be orienting to children towards.
Exactly. But so like we had to go out of our way to, even with our own son, to explain that. So like for me, social justice education, number one is just stepping in that John. Like, I'm being honest. Like, this is how the world is. But I'm also going to be honest with you and tell you this is my perspective. Because the person that tells you they're objective on something like fully means that they can fully take themselves out of being alive, that means they're lying to you. They're objectively wrong. They're objectively subjective. So I always go out my way to preface everything with that. Another thing is to kind of acknowledge kind of like the social structure and how children are socialized into a system that emphasizes obedience and compliance more than challenging and critically thinking. I always ask my students, like, how many of y'all went through a class all year round, didn't learn anything, but got an A? 100% across the board, the hands go up, right? And I said, well, what you did learn, I was like, pay attention to what you did learn. And then I would emphasize, did you have to like raise your hand to do this? Did you have to, you know what I mean? And I was like, well, that sounds like they were teaching you to be obedient and compliant. And, of course, there's a place for that in the younger grades. But when you start getting in high school, you know, like I was blessed enough to have the experience to go to a suburban school, schools, and also Philadelphia high school. So I saw the stark difference. Yeah.
Yes.
Like just the freedom and the humanizing or dehumanizing nature of those realities. So that's another thing I emphasize. And to build off of that, I always said to my students, like, teaching is a two-way street. And, you know, this is Freudian also. Teaching is a two-way street. So if I'm not learning from you, you're not learning from me. And I know that.
Facts.
And I would pull their card about that. And, you know, I always like try to get better. Like a good teacher is always like refining their craft, right? Mm-hmm. So I noticed that students place so much emphasis on grades. Like, Mister, what's my grade? Like, what's my grade? And I'm like, yo, if you're learning, you shouldn't even be worried about your grade. So one step that I moved towards to make it more social justice oriented in my classroom was to develop what I called Awoke Rubric.
Okay.
And, you know, it's kind of cheesy, but the way it is, there's 5 measures: asleep, drowsy, disoriented, awake, and woke. And I would have the students self-evaluate themselves towards the end of every marking period, but then I would sit and have a conversation about where I think they're at based on their writings, based on our discussions, based on how much I'm learning from them, how much, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And those type of humanizing conversations, those type of personal relationships that are developed that places the emphasis more on intellectual engagement in the pursuit of knowledge rather than just simply checking off the box, produced a much more egalitarian egalitarian situation within my classroom. And then I would also adopt kind of like ways where we would do group rulemaking or expectations for the class, but we would do it off the principles of Maya. And then the students would have to like, okay, I would always explain, like, this isn't a situation, like, I don't want to, especially high school level, I don't want a situation where I'm imposing like this like draconian discipline without your input, but then at the same time you should include your input on what it means to be disciplined inside, because like I was like, somebody punishing you is not discipline.
It is
you
not
having the internalized kind of structure to understand what's expected, and then you expecting that from others. That's how we created balance in the classroom.
For you to have intrinsic motivation and discipline. And I think compliance doesn't breed that in kids. I used to always try to talk more about cooperation. Let's have a cooperative environment, because cooperative means like there's an agreement involved. Compliance means you're going to do what I say. Cooperation means, hey, we have an understanding here, so we are agreeing to cooperate to make this space whole. So the word compliance in the high school world is something that, like, when we have documents, let's talk about cooperation. Let's teach our young people and talk to our young people about the benefits of cooperating within this system. And how much do we really need to punish young people for bucking back? Like, you actually want them to. Like, do we want young people to be compliant? I mean, if you're operating under white supremacist ideals, yeah, you do. But if you're trying to engage young people in true civil disobedience or true revolution or true fighting for liberation, I don't want you to be compliant. Like, your job is to buck up against the system. Your job is to challenge. Like, that is your job, to speak up, be empowered, and take action. So totally appreciate how you're running your classrooms. Now, we have some people that are probably listening who are doing a great job with implementing social justice in their classroom, but we have some who think that they really are, but in essence, right, it's social justice on a superficial level. So I would love to elaborate a little bit more on superficial social justice versus what authentic empowerment looks like for students.
Yeah, it's real interesting that you bring this up. I just think back. Number one, we're living in an era now, right, where so many people think that they're woke. And again, I'm putting that in parentheses, right? And even when I think of social justice education, and even being people associating me with that, I came into it that there were no, like, there was a liberatory framework, Asa Hillard, and, other great Africana scholars who've already mastered kind of like thinking about deep thought and like how our children learn how to break Eurocentric structures within the classroom. So like I went into education kind of like familiar with those type of things. So nowadays, though, I think there's a lot of language and performativeness around social justice that negates kind of like the deep ground deep thinking work that needs to be done, not in the sense just of like what's happening in the classroom, but the planning and the own personal and internal work that the educator needs to do. So like we can talk about identity for hours, right? I'm this, that, and the other. And that's good. Like there's a place for that. But if you don't know the historical context that created the conditions to even formulate how you think of yourself, already you're working from a deficit and you're not really getting to the root of the fact that, I co-sign the idea there's only one race, the human race, and race is a social construction. But, we live under those socially constructed definitions.
That's
and
right.
So to understand yourself better, to understand the God of Harriet Tubman isn't the same God of George Washington. You got to have a foundational base about what that actually means to how you orient yourself to even the universe, right? Yeah. So I don't think that's happening in social justice. A lot of spaces, I think that also has kind of been hijacked. A lot of times, like there was a point where I was even like saying, I don't like to use the word social justice, right? Because it's been kind of like one of those terms that loses its value and meaning over time.
So we're going to speak on this because it has lost its value, right? So when you talk about social justice, it has lost its value, because I think that what we really want folks to get to or to have in their classrooms is a true meaning of liberation and what liberation really means. Social justice has most definitely lost its value, because when you hear social justice, and this is just my perspective, what it has become synonymous with, and kind of what you're talking about, this performative view, that somehow people think that I need to get a bunch of students together to like do a protest or do a march. And I'm not saying that those things are not useful, but if you also aren't implementing the other things that you're talking about, educating yourself and educating your students, then what's the point of all of this? And if you're only going to tie a march or a protest back to Dr. Martin Luther King, then you are sadly mistaken on the history and resistance of the Black community. But I think that is huge for people to hear when we're talking about social justice inside the classrooms. Yes, it's important for students to identify an issue. Yes, it's important for students to learn how to advocate and use their voices. But what is also important is for students to understand their history, their place in the world, and why resistance or protest is even needed, and also saturated in their culture, in the culture of Black people. And I think that that's a huge understanding that's missing. I was having a conversation the other day, like Black people always got to protest something, right? Like if you go to a white school, right? I don't know if they're always protesting and marching and fighting for rights, right? Because they're given. But this is resistance is something that is saturated in our culture. The story of overcoming is something that Black people always have to deal with, but not understanding the connection and the story and the history behind it, then you are sorely missing something in your classroom if you're talking about implementing social justice, and those things are not happening at all.
Exactly. And I always go over that idea of that. It's so important to understand, like we're living in a society, right? And I'm talking about Black liberation right now, right? Yeah. That a group of people never existed in this world before as a unified identity group, right? We talking about folks Ashantis and Yoruba and like all these other groups of people, but in America it became Black, right? But that identity within itself, like you said, brought out, was like a basis of resistance, but resistance for when Black people were marching back in the day, they weren't marching just for Black people, they were marching for everybody. For everybody. No other group in the American context can say straight off the bat that their identity is somewhat rooted in that. And so it's so important, regardless of your racial identity, that you're aware of that. And that's another thing I always said to my students, like if you can't acknowledge or admit that Black people were never meant to be free in this society, then you hold anti-Black views. I don't care what you think you are. You can be pink with purple polka dots and call yourself like, Polynesian or something. You know what I mean? But like at the end of the day, if you still don't recognize that truth, then you probably hold anti-Black views, because we're indoctrinated with those views, because really that's a lot of what this society has been based off of and needs in order to function. It needs that hostility. It needs that kind of like rooted like bad guy criminal, which it has turned into, and it's always been rooted in that dichotomous situation. So like, that's why I always, when I brought it to, it didn't matter what race my students were. I always brought it to them like that. And I would even challenge them, like, you should ask your favorite teacher that question and see what the response is. And so if they say that, no, Black people were supposed to be free here, there, and the other, I was like, already off the bat, that person's anti-Black or holds anti-Black sentiments enough that they can't even look at the historical and present day reality of what the situation is. But see, that's where the danger is. And I'm so glad you brought up the Martin King example of like he had a dream and then Barack Obama became president and now Kamala Harris, right?
Whitewashing.
Yes,
oh,
it's I call it the myth of racial progress, right? And an NPR article came out early this week. Like, if you look at the situation that Black families are facing now, the median wealth for the average Black family is 52% behind the generation before us. That means Black people are doing much worse right now, financially, economically speaking, and we can bring up all the other indicators, right? But then instead, we're just playing lip service and be like, oh, look, Kamala Harris represents Ruby Bridges, who integrated a school that is now just as segregated, if not more, when she attended.
The single narrative of Black success is so pervasive. It's so pervasive. The single narrative that this one person made it and then somehow we all made it and that we should be happy and celebrating progress. But I want you to repeat the stat that you just repeated, and then I want people to reflect on if that's progress.
Yeah. So
can you repeat that stat one more time?
Yes. So the median wealth for the average Black millennial family is 52% behind the median wealth of the average Black family in the last generation. And, don't get it twisted, like white folks are behind. Also, white millennial families are behind, but they're only 5% behind. already on an exaggerated gap to begin with. So imagine those statistics, right? That's why you're hearing things now saying by 2050, Black median wealth will be at zero, if not below. It's only at like $5,000 right now. So like, when we're looking at this reality and we're not hearing and we're not really having these honest conversations about where we're actually at right now, that's what concerns me a lot, right? And then we try to understand, well, what's going on with our children in cities. Unfortunately, a lot of them engaging in intercommunal violence, and it's like, if they had knowledge, if those children were taught knowledge of self, if they were fully aware of their greatness and their excellence, right, this situation wouldn't be designed. But instead, we teach them the mentality of like, F you, pay me. I don't care about nobody but myself. Worry about yourself as an individual. Who cares about the collective? They don't, you know what I mean? And so like this message is continuously being pumped to students, by, maybe their overzealous parents who want them to be financially good, or their teacher telling them like, don't worry about those kids, just worry about yourself. Or from their friends, or from the music and the entertainment and everything. And so like it breeds a very confusion type of situation, which I believe a true understanding of Black history, understanding of content, even understanding of other cultures, right? Visiting other places breaks that, because you recognize it's not you that's the problem. It's them. It's the society. It's the normalized whiteness that you are being told is the way you should aspire to be. And just to quote Du Bois real quick, because I love this quote by Du Bois, he called it, the double consciousness.
Yep, I know what you were going to say.
Yeah, so like, it's like measuring yourself against the tape of a world that looks on with amused contempt and pity. And, our children feel that. They don't know what it means. They don't know what I just, you know what I mean? But they feel it and they internalize it, and either they reject it, accept it, or become part of it. And we live in one of the most violent societies man's ever created. And so we're surprised when our children reflect the values in which the society is teaching them.
Facts. And I say that all the time about living in America, one of the most violent and most racist societies. So even this whole new notion about like America is not racist, who's drumming that up? Like, what world are you folks living in, right? Even when we talk about violence, how violence is normalized but highlighted so heavily in our community to depict that Black children and Black people are just so animalistic and I'm not even going to take this to a whole nother level when we talk about this whole theoretical notion of black on black crime that does not exist. People kill people, and you kill who is in proximity to you. People kill their neighbors. Like, black people live in a community. Like, there's white on white violence. Like, so that even that whole notion, and that's sold and fed and again put in our children's heads. And then when you were talking about this whole idea of worry about yourself, it all has to do with the indoctrination of American society and living within a capitalistic society where you are trained to be American. So even in schools within yourself, your identity is stripped because you learn to be an American. But even understanding, like you say, that double consciousness of what American means, there's two different definitions of what it is to be an American. There's a white definition and a black definition. And what you're supposed to be in America and what we expect you to be, as opposed to like what you really are. And when black folks or folks of African descent understand that our struggle is all rooted together and we will not progress unless there is a notion of collectivism and community. And that is all of that is sorely erased from folks like Dr. Martin Luther King and 1964 civil rights movement. That it wasn't like I'm worrying about me, I'm worrying about everybody. And if society is not going to progress, so even when you talk about whiteness, you guys will not be good people or good humans, or whiteness will never be good until you treat people the right way. So it's less about struggle of rights or individual rights and more about a progression as a people and as a world. But that message gets completely lost, completely whitewashed. So even when we're talking about history teachers and you talking about Dr. Martin Luther King, or schools who want to keep raising up, this day of service, tell the truth. Tell the truth. Talk about who that man really was and what his legacy really stood for, and not what white Americans made it to be.
Yeah. And it's real interesting. You're like saying the same thing, like conclusions that a lot of my students in my class would make. Like right there, like what does it even mean to be a good person in a white supremacist society? Is that possible if you're not aware of that fact, right? And the implications surrounding that. But we're coming up on Malcolm X birthday, right? There's no coincidence. Malcolm X started talking like this. He ended up not lasting that long. No coincidence that Martin King, towards the end of his life, started talking like that, and he didn't last that long, right? The Black Panthers jumped off right off the gate with this more nuanced idea of what liberatory politics actually means. And it's one thing when you're just like attacking the surface level, like with the social justice, not to throw too much shade, social justice nonprofit industrial complex does nowadays. But like at the same time, once you really speak about the economics, when you really speak about the situation facing our children, the confusion out in the world, that's when you become a threat, because you are addressing the core reason of society. That's why all these state legislators, they're trying to pass bills that outlaw teaching critical race theory. Like, teachers are teaching critical race theory out there like that anyway. And all these things, because even just talking about it is a threat to their identity and their existence. But then at the same time, it's a benefit to our children to be able to have an identity and a real existence where they don't get confused over who they are and what they mean, their excellence within this society.
Yes, how excellent they are, and who's going to try to diminish or stomp down your excellence in this society. All of that is extremely important, and those are what principles of social justice in the classroom should be rooted in, right? Like, those are the things that's the starting block for how you are teaching children. I want to also get to real quick talking about your new position with curriculum, because we're talking about all of this, and to be honest, right, some teachers are in the classroom who just aren't equipped and don't have the tools, right? Or they follow a framework, or they follow a curriculum book. And we all know, right, like who used to be in charge of those things, right? White men created the dichotomy of what we should be functioning under. So to have you in a position as a Black man, as a brother of African descent, to be in control of curriculum, I would love for you to elaborate a little bit on like what your intention is with the social studies curriculum that you'll be in charge of.
Well, first, I want to be surprised. I was shocked that I lasted that long as a teacher, and I'm even more shocked that they hired me in this position, simply because I'm unapologetic about this. I want to step into the situation and be honest about what needs to be done for the benefit of our children, specifically Black children, but generally everybody, because if Black children benefit, everybody benefit. But for me, it is it becomes part of what needs to be done. So the things that I'm focusing on is relooking at the African American history curriculum. So Dr. Carr, in collaboration with several others, wrote this wonderful curriculum when it first became a mandatory subject in 2005. But due to ownership issues and other issues of a lack of continuity in the social studies department at the school district, that curriculum kind of has been lost almost. So there's tons of teachers who are coming into Philadelphia schools being told, you're teaching African American history. The only thing they know about Black people is like Jet Magazine and Meek Mill, and don't, you know what I mean? So like, my focus right there is to revamp the African American history curriculum, bring in experts to train folks, and then also create a mentorship of like experienced and also very knowledgeable teachers who teach African American history to be kind of like coaches and mentors for other teachers. There's also something exciting coming out of the University of Missouri, Carter Center. Shout out to LeGarrette King. He's working right now on a Black History certification where folks can do a 1-year program, get a certification. So like, hopefully that's down the pipe. We can work on that in Philadelphia. But like, as you can tell, I'm thinking long-term on how to revamp that, especially the fact that we're reaching in 2030. 2025 will be the 20th anniversary of when it became a graduation requirement. So we're only 4 years away from that. So we really need to revamp, kind of strengthen it again. Another focus has been embedding anti-racism and social justice type of frameworks within the curriculum. It doesn't matter what subject is social studies. So a perfect example of this, we rewrote 7th grade social studies curriculum, which focuses on Western civilization. So, you know, when you folks focus on Western civilization, it's like Europe, the Black Plague, you know, all this nonsense, right? Yeah. We only spend 1/4 on Europe. The other quarters are spent at looking at the indigenous populations and regions in North and South America and the Caribbean.
You know, that's different. That's real different.
Exactly. It's like a total mind shift. So like, and we stepped away from textbooks. Like, we're not doing textbooks anymore. We're writing it out. Everything's available through the internet. We can hyperlink it on a Google Doc that you can easily access to, and it can become technology. The ground floor. Exactly. But that allows us to pull from all over the place and then put it in one place in a storyline and a narrative that really shifts from the Eurocentric story of history and places it from the narrative of groups who have been historically excluded from including their story. So like, even in US history, man, we spend a lot of time looking at Americans' policy towards indigenous groups. And then how did those indigenous groups resist? How did those indigenous groups link up with other Black groups in the 60s and 70s? In US history, we're not talking about AFAM. So I'm really excited about the direction in which the school district is going. I think me getting hired in this position is a reflection of a desire of some folks in the school district to see this happen on a real authentic level, not just like putting a poster up on your wall and saying, you know, yes, I believe in, you know, whatever new thing of trend of the day is. So those are my focuses. I definitely want to involve community members in curriculum. Whether that would be feedback or even just explaining it to them. And I would also like to involve students in providing some type of like advisement and guidance on best pedagogical practices for them, which they enjoy like the best for teaching the subject, and even refining that and coming up with best practices and a non-negotiable list for teaching African American history. What's non-negotiable when you're teaching it? Like, you should, if you don't know you're including Black authors and Black narratives, that's a non-negotiable. Like, you should not be getting away with that. So all these type of things is really what we're focused on. Social studies has been the Wild West in the school district simply because it's not tested. But we're going to clamp down on that and prioritize just making this curriculum the best it can be, and deviate from traditional ways of how these things are taught.
And I think that it's amazing too that like we're talking about social studies curriculum and not pinging it as African American history. I talk a lot about the fact that history is separate from African American history, and I don't understand why. I mean, I do understand why, right? Because a certain narrative needs to be pervasive and needs to be told, and that is what white history is. But the combination of the work that you're going to be doing with social studies and history, with flipping it from a Eurocentric view, I think is extremely important. A model to be followed, and I'm excited to see what happens and what this turns into. Like, that's super dope.
Yeah,
I also want to give you opportunity to plug the fellowship that you were speaking of. Let the people hear about that.
Yes, thank you so much. So last year, and this was like a year in the making leading up to last year, but we, the Melanated Educators Collective, in partnership with Black Lives Matter Philly, developed a mini grant type of opportunity for Black educators. So one thing that, you know, all the research and studies show that Black educators love teaching. They love teaching, I don't mean to generalize, but like, in places where folks come from, right? Where, the kids need the most type of supports. Mm-hmm. So as a result of that, a lot of folks leave though after a little bit because they're not provided supports as educators. So the Melanated Educators Collective, in partnership with BLM Philly, started offering up to about $2,000 mini grants to Black educators to pursue projects, pet projects that normally wouldn't be funded by the school, or they might have difficulty getting money for. Radical ones, you know what I mean? Or like ways to set up the room or provide more services to more at-risk youth. So this year is our second round. We're super excited. We're able to offer much more money this time than we did last time, and to more people. It is a mini grant opportunity. It's a simple form you fill out. Applications are due May 15th, and we'll be announcing who won by the middle of this summer, and you would receive those funds for your project. Eventually, we do want to move towards also including political education and creating a real network of fellowship of educators. But we think the first step is so important to get some resources into Black educators' hands so they can do the best that they can do. And then they feel like they're part of a larger community that is actually there to support them.
Dope. I think that's amazing. So folks listening, make sure you take advantage of that. Mama Twin wants to make sure that you're still having the book club for the old heads this summer. She just want to make sure that that's going to keep going.
It's going down. It's going down. I'll keep you in the loop. Our first planning meeting is this week, I believe, or next week. I forget.
Facts. Amazing. Well, this has been an amazing, I think, definitely for me, eye-opening hour with you. I appreciate all the work you've been doing over these years and the work that you are about to do. We will definitely be keeping an eye on you for your greatness. Do you want to have any final words before we close out to the viewers?
The only thing I want to say is I'm always humbled to be able to speak and on these issues, and folks listening. So I want you to know that, we stand on the shoulders of our ancestors, and we are them and they are us, and the future generations yet to come, we are also them. And so it's just so important to understand that it's cyclical, not linear.
Thanks. Well, thank you everybody for joining us this week, and we thank our guest Ish. He has been amazing. Remember, this is Teacher Appreciation Week, so hashtag thank a Black teacher. As always, I hope you enjoyed today's show, so please comment, like, and share, but also hashtag thank a Black teacher. So dear Black teachers, our students, our classrooms, and our world shine brighter because of your light. So here at the center, we thank you and we love you. And again, as always, I appreciate all the support and thank everybody for watching. So until next time, we'll see you next week here live on Thursday for Building the Black Educator Pipeline.